Hey YouTube, this is Archangel for Truth, and my topic for you today is this: fear versus freedom. Now, this is a very important topic and one that deserves deeper thought, because ultimately what we observe happening in our world today is basically where we have allowed our fears to consume us and to cause us to become irrational. Now, when I'm saying this, I'm not just saying as to one nation or any particular group of people, but rather just in general in how we choose to address those things that ultimately cause us to be afraid. So, here's my question for you. This is a little exercise I'm asking you to participate in. I want you to think back to that moment when you began to fear something. Might be during a time of childhood, could be something as simple as being afraid of monsters under your bed, or being afraid of the boogeyman, or it may seem laughable right now, but you think about it and you observe how people are reacting to things going on around the planet right now with this virus and so forth. Shutting down the entire world's economy over a virus. I mean, we've lived throughout the entire history of man on this planet filled with viruses and bacterias and so forth. But we have really lost control as to our rationality in dealing with our own fears. Now, I want to make clear my focus is not in simply dealing with, the coronavirus and so forth. I'm talking about in general, mainly. There are certain areas I will bring up, pertaining to fear and how people choose to not only allow that fear to rob them of their own freedoms, but they're willing to utilize it to rob other people of their freedoms. We see this as a perfect example when government chooses to violate the rights of people, their rights and freedoms. And so they come up with varying man-made regulations and demand people follow those things. And if you don't, we all know what happens. But just like that youthful child who allowed their fears to govern their reactions, so also the reactions that people have over these things are so sometimes completely absurd. Now, I'll give you an example. Now we've gotten to the point where there's an expectation for people to be able to identify themselves to law enforcement. There was a time when that expectation was not there. But we can look to see numerous of accounts just on YouTube alone of interactions with police and how they respond to people choosing not to identify themselves. It's a fear-based reaction. Now, that being said, we need to understand. Look, there are people out there whose intent is to do harm. That is real. And we need to recognize that. We need to recognize that there are individuals that are there to deal with those types of individuals. But that doesn't mean that we all need to live in fear. And that we need to be governed by fear. Or enslaved to it by a government who uses fear to enslave us. You know, I would ask you to consider, look at the people over in China or North Korea. You know, the government restricts their ability to think and to look at information that causes them to question those that are ruling over them. You know, I see a similar pattern happening now. And ultimately, we see it with social media. We see it with YouTube. We see it in all sorts of varying forms, whether it be the fake news media. It doesn't matter. Lately, I've observed it even with people who have a difference of opinion. It's almost like people are too afraid to hear other people out. Here's an example of that. You know, I count myself as a Christian sovereign constitutionalist. Not a sovereign citizen, but a Christian sovereign constitutionalist. And I put those things in a specific order for a specific reason. And ultimately, I'll get into that some other time, but ultimately I want to keep the focus in as pertaining to this issue of fear versus freedom. And so I am able to talk with people who disagree with me. I'm able to be respectful to people who disagree with me. I have no qualms with people who feel that they need to have a system in place that makes them feel safer. You know, that's fine. If you need to have that for yourself, all well and good. My problem is when those very people allow their fears to infringe upon my freedoms. And that's where we're at nowadays. You see, when the founding fathers of this nation chose to break off the yoke of England, their purpose was to maintain that freedom and to break away from the fears that ultimately had enslaved them. You know, with England, we know that ultimately they were trying to tax in any way, shape, or form. And for them, their fear was not having enough gold or riches to achieve their or continue to spread out their empire, whatever it be. And even their own empire was a reaction out of fear. You know, but ultimately what that did is it allowed they allowed their fears to ultimately to use that as a means to tax the colonists here with their tax to build that revenue. That's just one small way. But we see the same pattern happening in the various man-made states. See, have you ever wondered why it is that man-made government? Because that's what it is. It is all man-made. We know by means of the Declaration of Independence that the purpose of government originally was to protect our freedoms. But now the purpose of government is to keep that fear as a means of control, to utilize it to justify why they can even infringe those rights and freedoms that are so listed even in the Constitution itself. They would call this a safety justification. For safety reasons, they come up with all sorts of laws and reasons why they must do what they must do. And they will argue, if you ever argue with someone who is a statist and talk to them, I guarantee you every single time they will use fear as their reasoning why it needs to be this way, why laws need to be established in such a way. Now, I want to be clear. I don't believe in lawlessness. The difference of the kinds of laws I believe in and the laws that those that are statists believe in is ultimately this. See, God established laws that are beneficial for us. And if we would actually adhere to those laws, then we wouldn't have these problems. And it's not that these laws ultimately are benefiting God in any sort of way. They're benefiting us. And so ultimately what we have is we have states that form laws, and they use these laws in a way of unjust enrichment for the state and building revenue for the state. So that's what we have. Now, I mentioned earlier that I deal with a lot of individuals who disagree with me as pertains to sovereignty and, what rights we have and what freedoms we have. And what I've observed about them is they're just consumed by fear, but they don't see it. And I'll give you an example. So I'll go on to their YouTube channels and try to discuss why it is that what they're saying is not correct. And instead of dealing with the merits of what I'm saying, they'll just block my commentary. And ultimately, that's their choice. If they wish to react out of fear, that's fine. I'm still going to care for people regardless. I believe that's the best way to go. And, even Jesus himself, when they ultimately put him up on the cross and spat upon him and beat him and did all sorts of bad things to him. At the end of the day, Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." That, for me, is my guidance. Now, there are days when I'm not talking about forgiveness of them. I'm, imperfect. I want to see justice. I want to see people respect the freedoms and rights of others and not infringe these things because they are afraid. They're too afraid to be free, and they're too afraid to let you be free. And ultimately, that's what they do. So I would say that there is a way that we can set ourselves free from this entanglement with fear. And it comes from a scripture in the Bible taken from 1 John chapter 4, verse 18. It says, "There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear." Because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. So my question to each of you, whether you agree with me pertaining to individual sovereignty or not, how can we perfect our love towards one another if we can't even talk to each other and be respectful to each other and recognize that in one form or another, there's a fear there, whether it's their fear of people going too far or our fear that they're trying to take too much. My hope, my goal is to love better. I pray that God may do whatever work he needs to do within my heart to be able to do that. Try to remember that Jesus set the example. And despite the many things that were done to him, at the end of the day, he still had love. He didn't allow fear to grip him. And here's the deal. He is forever free. This is my message for each and every one who hears this. Let us perfect our love for one another. Let us cast this fear aside and let us respect each other's freedom. And with that, I say, God bless. Take care.